Hi, welcome to Board Gems. In this video series, I like to look at older games and tell you whether I think they're still gems or not. This is my first gem video in a few months. I took a break in summer and haven't quite gotten into it yet, so I might be a little rusty, but I'm returning to a great game. The game was originally Quo Vadis. This came out in '92, I want to say, from Hans im Glück, celebrated German publisher Hans im Glück, and designed by Reiner Knizia. It was in his early design phase where he started to get his first games published, especially with Hans im Glück. So you have Quo Vadis and you have Auf Heller und Finnisch, otherwise known as Kingdoms, Modern Art, all published by Hans im Glück, all great games. This is a negotiation game about the Roman Senate. It's for 3 to 5 players, ages, actually I have no idea. I will say ages 10 and up, and takes maybe an hour. This was one of the early games that Mayfair printed. So you know how in the early days where they were making English versions of German games, some of these classic games, which would later on become classics, they were already printed. They weren't making more copies of them. So a company like Mayfair, when they come in and they're making English versions of this game, they have to make it themselves. So they make a game. They also called it Quo Vadis, which in Latin means where are you going? Appropriate in this game where people are trying to negotiate and they're asking where each other is intending to go as part of the negotiations. And then in the mid to late 2000s, Amigo made an edition of this, but shrunk down to a tiny, tiny little box. I would say probably like this size. Great for your shelf, but for a game that arguably plays best 4 or 5 players, like the more the better, the tiny board was sometimes can be hard to really feel like you're getting into it. That's my experience with those sorts of games. The more players, the smaller the board, just the more detached people might feel. People weren't really clamoring for a new version of this, but Bitewing Games, which I think happen to be big Reiner Knizia fans, they wanted to make a new version, but they went back to the designer with, I think, a presentation and said, here are some changes that we think the game needs in order to make it in today's hobby market. So a change of setting, improvement of the game for fewer players, but also supporting more players. And the result is Quo Vadis. Not a huge fan of the pun name, but at least it does have a nod to the old game. Even if to most people it doesn't mean anything. You can play it identically to the old game, but it does have some improvements. So it has better support for fewer players, and that there are some neutral pieces on the board that can be moved around. The game now supports 7 people out of the box. Let me show you how this plays. I'm going to show you this one, because this is what you're going to buy in stores if you wanted to get this. But the old one's fine too. You can get it in used, and I don't think it's too hard. And afterwards, I'll talk about whether it's still a gem or not. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players with the side for the correct number of players. So this game plays 3 to 7. This side of the board is for 3 to 5. This one's for 6 to 7. I'll set it up for a 4-player game, let's say. If you're familiar with Quo Vadis, this is new. Peacocks. Place 1 peacock on every space that matches the player count. So in this case, I'm doing a 4-player game. I'll put peacocks on all the 4s. On the side of the board, place all the laurel tokens that show a 1. In the bag, go everything else. All the laurel tokens that show a higher number, I think it goes as high as 5, as well as special ones, which have a 2 and a little extra something on there. You're going to mix these up and place 1 on every laurel wreath space. On top of this space, you place the zookeeper token. It covers it like that. You're always able to look underneath it and see what's being covered. Each player gets a screen. Behind your screen, you're going to take 2 1-value laurel tokens. In addition, you're going to get all the pawns of the same animal type, the same color, These all normally go in front of your screen. Players can always, but it doesn't really matter because each player has 6 and you can see how many you still have by looking at how many are on the board. But each player will also get 2 of these special power tokens. This little reminder via iconography what this power does. And each power token has between 0 and 2 of these little laurel symbols on it. That's how many laurels / points that you get if you're able to use your power. But for now, you hang them up on your screen to show that they are still to be used. And after that, it's just determine a start player and you're ready to begin. The goal of the game is to get the most laurel tokens. You start off with 2 1s. There are more that you can pick up along the way from the bottom of the board up to the star exhibit. The player with the most points wins. However, any players that do not have a pawn in the star exhibit cannot win. So you have 2 goals. Your goal is to get one of your pawns into the star exhibit and to collect as many laurel tokens on the way if possible. Players' pawns start on the bottom of the board and via these routes will be able to move forward up the board and hopefully reach the star exhibit. On a player's turn, you have one of 4 possible actions. The first is to add a pawn onto the board. No pawns start on the board. On your turn, you can take one of your pawns and place it on any empty space in these bottom 4 exhibits. Peacocks are neutral, but they still take up space in the exhibit. So this exhibit has 5 spaces. This one is currently occupied by a peacock. But you can place a pawn in any empty space in any of the bottom 4 exhibits. That's one action you can do. A different action you can do is to advance a pawn, but each exhibit requires majority vote to leave it. If a player is in a 1-space exhibit, then they already have the majority. They need 1 vote, they give it to themselves, and on your turn you can simply advance to the next exhibit, assuming that the space is empty. Notice that all the paths leading out of the 1-space exhibits do not have any laurel tokens. Also, if you are in an exhibit and the route out of the exhibit has the zookeeper, then you can simply advance to the next exhibit. The zookeeper lets you pass. If you make it to the star exhibit, fill up the spaces in numerical order so you always know who gets there first. That's a tiebreaker. You don't need a vote if the zookeeper is there. The zookeeper can help you leave. But in any other circumstance, in order to advance a pawn, you need a majority number of votes. How many votes do you need? It's based on the number of spaces, the size of the exhibit. These 2 exhibits have only 1 space, and so you only need 1 vote. If you're there, you can vote for yourself. You succeed, you have the majority, and you can advance. But in all these other exhibits, these ones have 3 spaces, these ones have 5. There are some on the back of the board that have 7 for a 6 or 7 player game. You need majority votes to advance. If you're in a 3-space exhibit, you need 2 votes to advance. If you're in a 5-space exhibit, you need 3, and a 7-space exhibit, you need 4. Votes are provided by the other animals in that exhibit. Right now, this pawn cannot advance at all, because in order to advance out of a 5-space exhibit, you need 3 votes, and there are only 2 animals there. In the case of a 5-space exhibit, as soon as there are 3 animals, it is now possible. And as your action, you can advance a pawn if you have the votes. So if the exhibit looked like this, and you're the marmoset and you want to advance, you will need to secure the votes of 2 other animals. These 2 are controlled by players. You can try to make a deal with them, and this will require negotiation. You'll ask the crocodile player, you'll ask the tiger player what they might want in exchange for a vote. You can also bribe the peacock. These are all ways in which you can secure votes. If they vote for you and you advance, they will actually get a 1 laurel token. So they're already getting a benefit, but they may want more. You may offer tokens behind your screen. You may offer future favors. Anything that's not fulfilled this turn is non-binding. They can also bribe the peacock. In order to bribe a peacock for a vote, you need to give the peacock, that is, throw out of the game, put it back in the box, a token that is worth more than 1. So if you had a 2 or even a 5, you could throw away those points, put them back in the box, and that's bribing the peacock. Now the peacock has your vote. If there were 2 peacocks in there, you would need to bribe them both. In this sort of situation, the marmoset could deal with the crocodile, maybe bribe a peacock, or could also only deal with the tiger player. The tiger player has 2 votes, having 2 animals in that exhibit. If more players than needed want to vote for you, you can choose which votes to accept, and only those players will get a 1. So if the marmoset secures the votes of the tiger player, then both tigers vote for him. The tiger player would get 2 tokens, 1 for each vote. But if the crocodile player was also willing to vote, well, marmoset doesn't need all those votes. They could split it. 1 vote from the crocodile, only 1 vote from the tiger. And then each of those players would get 1. Now, when a player advances, they choose which path to take, and this can be part of negotiation too. The tiger player might say, "I'll give you your vote, assuming you go this way. But if you want to go this way, I am not giving you the vote." And again, because it's your turn, any promises you make that you can fulfill on this turn are binding. So in order to get that player's votes, you would need to do what they say. But if they say something like, "I'll vote for you if you vote for me next time," you are not required to follow through since it's on a later turn. But assuming you advance, you take the path, and then you get the token that's on that path, and it goes behind your screen to be immediately replaced by a new one. So that's the second possible action, advancing a pawn. And if you choose a pawn to try to advance and you do some negotiations, but you just can't make a deal, you can always pick another action. You're not stuck doing nothing. But there are 2 other actions you can do. You can advance a peacock. Peacocks don't need votes. If you've ever seen a peacock in a zoo, you know they have the run of the place. They can go wherever they want. So you can pick any peacock on the board and simply advance them to an exhibit further up field. They don't take the token. You, however, would get a 1-point token from the peacock as thanks. And peacocks can make it into the exhibit, which is always wonderful. If you're playing a 5-player game and a peacock gets into the exhibit, okay, you know somebody's not going to make it. And the 4th possibility is to move the zookeeper. The zookeeper makes it possible to advance out of an exhibit without getting the necessary votes. Any player in an exhibit behind the zookeeper can, on their turn, advance a pawn through the zookeeper to an exhibit further upfield, again assuming that the space is empty. The zookeeper makes it easy to advance, however, you don't get a laurel token. The zookeeper covers it, makes it unavailable. So on your turn, you can move the zookeeper, and that's all that happens on your turn. It is, however, possible to do some things as extras on your turn. You'll see some of the laurel tokens have a little extra symbol on them. When a player advances a pawn and collects a token, they keep the token, but immediately they can do that action. If they don't do it right now, it's forfeit. And later on, since they're putting it behind their screen, if later on they give this token to somebody else, then they don't get to do it. This is just a one-time thing that happens as the pawn moves across it. This one allows a player to move a peacock for free. This one allows you to move the zookeeper for free. And this one allows you to get a special power back. Each player has 2 special powers. Each pawn type, each animal type has a different special power. You are not allowed to use the special power on your turn. It's something that its use can be traded away. I'll give just one example, which is the marmoset action. When a player takes a token, instead of taking the one on the path, they can instead take any laurel token on the board. So the tiger player may say, "Hey, I want to advance, can I have your vote?" And the marmoset player may say, "Well, I'm happy to give you your vote if you give me some points or maybe some future considerations. Do you also want to consider using my special power? I can use this special power on your turn when you move, so that instead of claiming this pitiful little 2 token, you can instead take any other token on the board. Ooh, this 5 looks nice. For my benefit, this is used up. This goes behind your screen. Only the ones stuck to your screen are usable. But the number of laurel kind of wreaths here on the length of the metal ribbon is how many laurel tokens you get. So this has 1. So for using this power, I get 1 point in laurel tokens, and that goes behind my screen. This token allows me to get a special power back if I've already used it. If I collect this, then I would get 2 points, goes behind my screen. I immediately take one of my special powers that I've already used and put it back up on my screen. If I can use that again, I'm going to get another laurel token. So on your turn, you just do one of those 4 actions. Place a pawn on one of the 4 entry exhibits, advance a pawn, advance a peacock, or move the zookeeper. And play continues clockwise, all these things happening until the star exhibit fills up. In a 3 to 5 player game, that's 5 spaces. It's 7 spaces in a 6 or 7 player game. So if this fills up, something like this, maybe a peacock got in here, maybe a second one got in here, doesn't matter. These are the 3 players who have made it to the star exhibit. Of these 3 players, the player with the most points from behind their screen that they've collected over the course of the game is the winner. And in case of a tie, it's whoever got there first. That's it. You're ready to play Quo Vadis. I don't know if there were a lot of people who were clamoring for a remake of Quo Vadis. It's a good game. It's from Knizia's early time, like the early 90s, and he had some classics that I love in that time frame, such as modern art, such as Aufheller und Finish, otherwise known as Kingdoms. Also, those 2 were also originally Hans and Glück games, and so is this one. Very unusual for Hans and Glück. This came with English rules in the box, and unfortunately there seems to be a mistranslation in them. The English rules seem to suggest that deals are binding for 1 full round at the table. That's how I read it, and that's how I played it for the longest time. It still works. But anyway, nobody's really been asking for this. It's a good game, but the style has kind of fallen out of fashion a bit, hasn't it? First of all, it's a negotiation game. It's definitely not in the current zeitgeist that negotiation is like the big thing everybody's clamoring for. And the setting, which is Roman Senate. Now, I think that setting is great because it suggests a lot of intrigue, political jockeying, maybe even some backstabbing, which absolutely happens in this game. The Roman Senate is a great setting for this game, but also Roman stuff also has kind of fallen out of fashion. It's a very old-fashioned German setting, trading in the Mediterranean, just anything to do with Europe and antiquity in general was very popular among German games back then. I've always liked it, and I think it's fascinating how it was remade. Bitewing, big fans of Reiner Knizia. They went to him. They were interested in republishing Quo Vadis, but they sent him kind of a presentation, their sort of analysis of how that game would fit in the current market, and it didn't very well. It, just for the reasons I mentioned, negotiation's kind of out of favor, the setting is certainly out of favor. Also, the game plays 3 to 5 players officially. Even if it's said 2 players, don't even think about it. But it doesn't scale. I think of it as a Goldilocks game, in that 4 players is kind of the sweet spot, and then 5 players is a bit more cutthroat, a bit more, crowded, and 3 players is just way too loose. And for hobbyists, that often translates to the more players, the better. Whereas I feel like the game was intended, this is my opinion, of course, I don't know the intention, but it feels like it was targeted for 4 players. And it's still playable with 3, it's still playable with 5, it's just a little different, but we don't have to change any of the rules to accommodate that. A game that's arguably best with 5, and only goes up to 5, can be tricky. You want something that plays a little bit better with lower player counts, or increase the player count so it can handle 6 players, maybe even 7. This is very much a modernization of this. It definitely changes some things to make it fit with the current hobbyist zeitgeist. For example, replacing a historical setting, which people either find boring or they're just not that into it. Like, Roman Senate is not really featured much in like pop culture stuff nowadays, right? So update that to what's in style at the time, anthropomorphic animals. What is also in style? Special powers. Gotta have special powers. Everybody wants special powers. So every time you play the game, you can use a different special power and it feels almost like a new game. Now, I have seen classic old school German designers do that. Add special powers to a game that they made, in an older era, and they're updating it to fit with the modern zeitgeist. So an example I can think of is Hansa, not Hansa Teutonica, Hansa by Michael Schacht, a new version called Traders of the Air, has special powers. They are, of course, completely optional because Hansa didn't have them. And sometimes those old designers, I get the vibe, because if I was them, that would be me. I don't really believe in the special powers. Like, I believe in balancing, and sometimes those special powers are just very difficult to balance unless they're just super simple and also not very influential. And I just feel like it's easy for a designer to just phone them in. With all due respect to Michael Schacht, who's one of my favorite designers, I suspect that those special powers in Traders of the Air were kind of phoned in a little bit. Oh, you want special powers? Okay, here's a few. There you go. But the powers here are very well thought out. There's a nice variety of them. It goes up to 7 players now, a game that is arguably best at 5. Try to push it. See, can it go 6? Can it go 7? Yes, it can. Being 7 different factions, 7 different animal types, there's 7 different player powers. The special powers themselves are not balanced per se, just the powers alone. But, of course, there's the expectation in a negotiation game that players can self-balance. But there's a sort of an encouragement in the game to do so, because each special power has a different point value when it's used. The more powerful powers, the ones that help people the most, don't give any victory points for using them. But because they're so powerful, you are able to fleece other players, get them to give you more points so that they can use your special power. And that is, of course, a really special thing about these special powers. So special. Everything's special. You don't use them on yourself, you use them on other people. You cannot use them on yourself. You have to trade away those special powers, and not for some future thing, like, here's my special power, we'll trade it for something and you can use it later. No, you have to use it now. It makes the negotiations much more impactful, and more complicated too. I mean, I give credit to Bitewing because all the player screens have all the special abilities printed on the back. So you can always reference it mid-game. It's a fact, though, that it does make the game a bit more complicated, because the trades can get more complicated. You're not just trading for votes, you're also trading maybe to try to take the shortcut to a different exhibit, as they call them in this game, right? Or a committee in Quo Vadis. There are shortcuts in the game that one of the special powers allows a player to travel through. So it's not just getting the most votes to advance, but, where to advance? Do I use the shortcut? Maybe I can arrange to take somebody with me, right? Which is another special power. Or you can advance, and if somebody uses their special power, you can advance even if there's no space for you in the exhibit/committee. Very well done special powers, and they are self-balanced because the powerful ones don't give you victory points when they're used. But you can get more victory points from the players because they're so powerful. That's the idea anyway. Where I kind of ended up standing, at first I didn't like the special powers. Later on, I kind of came around to them, in part because I just became more familiar with them, of course. But it does make the negotiations a little bit more strenuous because there's more factors to consider. It's there's more space up here taken when you're doing the negotiations. So where I've kind of settled on is for few players, if you're playing with just a couple of players, 3, 4, I mean, I probably wouldn't play it with 3 anyway, but 4 or 5, don't mind to throw it in there. The game doesn't need it, but I would imagine most hobbyists would prefer to have it, and I don't mind it. For 6 or 7 players, which this game does support, amazingly, I would probably prefer not to play with the special powers, just to keep the negotiations moving at a bit of a better clip. I like games that kind of play a little bit with the endgame conditions, and Knizia likes to do this, famously for his game High Society. The goal is to win the most stuff, which are worth victory points, and you do that via auction. But the player who spends the most money cannot win. They're eliminated. The winner is the player who has the most points out of everybody else. A little bit of a similar thing going on in Quo Vadis and Quo Vadis is that the final committee / exhibit is the goal. You're always advancing toward that final room. The winner is still the player with the most points, but you cannot win unless you're in that final room, which is great because it adds a bit of time pressure. There's nothing to stop one player from having multiple pieces in there, blocking potentially other players from being able to get in there. It offers a bit of blackmail, right? Oh, you want to get in here? I can stop you. Maybe I move my person in and then you can't. How much is it worth it to you for me not to do that? Because I was already in there. I don't need to move it in, but I could just block you for the hell of it. How much are you willing to pay me to not do that? You could be a dick. Like all negotiation games, whether it works for any particular person is hit or miss, but in my opinion, you want a game that's divisive. You want a game that you either love or you hate. You don't want a game that just everybody finds boring. You want a game that, hey, maybe it's not for you, and that's completely fine. If you don't like negotiation, give this a miss. For people who are into it, this is an amazing experience. They added another little factor, a little rules tweak, some extra components, that bumps up that threat. It adds more time pressure for players to get into the final exhibit, and it allows for more shenanigans. And that's the addition of the peacocks. If you visited a zoo, you probably know peacocks got the run of the place. So that was a nice bit of a thematic flourish there that they did. They're neutral pieces that can be bribed. You can get their vote. Like if other players are being obstinate and they're not helping you advance, worst case, if there's peacocks in there, you can pay with points in order to get their vote and advance. But you can also get points, just 1 point each, by advancing a peacock. If you have a pawn in the exhibit already, so that victory condition is met, and you're competitive on victory points, like you think you have the most or, close to the most, on your turn, you can just advance a peacock. You get 1 point for it, so you're still getting points out of it, but it also increases the time pressure on the other players who are not in that final exhibit. Like if you're playing a 5-player game or a 7-player game, if even one peacock gets into that final exhibit, somebody else isn't. Love the peacocks. In fact, I added a little note to my copy of Quo Vadis, just so for 3 or 4 players, you can use a non-player color to simulate the peacocks. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. I'm kind of iffy on the special powers. Like I said, the game doesn't need it. Hobbyists need it. If it doesn't have special powers, won't it get samey? If you play like 10, 20 times, will it feel kind of samey unless you have the special powers? I was like, oh god, you're not going to... Be honest with yourself, you're not going to play it 10 or 20 times. I know you. But yes, the game is completely fine playing it 10 or 20 times without the special powers. Don't lean on the special powers as a crutch. Get into the negotiation part. I have a few negotiation games. A favorite of mine is Chinatown, which I've covered for the channel. And I love Chinatown. If you were to ask me, do you need both Chinatown and Quo Vadis? Probably not. They both play up to 5, and arguably, 4 or 5 players is probably the best. Maybe you don't need both. But with this new edition, even going up to 7 players, if you're looking for a negotiation game, this is one of the best you can get. I certainly enjoyed Quo Vadis at the time. Didn't get played much, So I'm happy that it has a new edition that refreshes it in people's minds and that they're able to revisit it and get into it anew. Because some people just have a problem playing an old board game, right? They just don't necessarily believe that it's a good game just because it's old. But if there's a new version, ooh, that means that somebody thinks it's good. Somebody who's willing to put some money behind it, right? If I compare it to Chinatown, Chinatown is just a bit too all in, right? So if you have like a 4-player game, for example, you might have 2 people branching off and 2 people branching off and talking amongst each other, and you're kind of missing what happens. Now in Quo Vadis, instead, on a certain player's turn, maybe you don't really have anything to offer. Your animals are not in the exhibits that they are, so they don't need your votes for anything. I don't mind this game can have brief lulls where you are not helpful necessarily to the person whose turn it is, so you don't have anything to offer. The game happens in waves. I'm important now, I'm not so important on another turn, and that's fine, right? It allows you to focus on the important deals, then you can kind of rest your mind in between. But if the sound of a lull in negotiation bothers you, well, you could look at Chinatown. But this game also addresses that because of the special powers. Even if you can't help somebody directly in a vote, you can help them with your special power. And of course, you get something out of it too, potentially victory points. There's a retail version of this and a deluxe edition. The difference with the deluxe edition are that they have wooden tokens instead of cardboard. But the cardboard tokens are very, very nice. Did an amazing job with the presentation. It looks great. The components are great. The only slight downside for me with this presentation, besides the anthropomorphic animals, which I'm not sure why we're not tired of that yet. In this version, the board is bigger. And when you're playing with more players, like 5 or more, in the case of Quo Vadis, you want a big board so everybody feels connected to the action. I used to have the old Amigo edition of this from the mid to late 2000s. And it was a tiny little box, same as To Court the King. Do I have it here? Same size as this. You can see how small that is. And it was probably a 3-fold, so the board opened so like twice the size and then maybe 3 times again. Or maybe it was 3 times and then 2 like that. I'm trying to remember. I don't have it anymore. But a small game that's arguably best with 5 players. The problem is that some people feel a little bit distant from the board and they don't feel as connected to the action. When you're playing with many players, you want a big board. The board in Quo Vadis is not tiny, it is smaller than Quo Vadis. And for the fact that it plays more players and the pawns are smaller too, that's really the only disappointment that I have about this game. If you feel like there's a negotiation hole in your collection and you want to add a game to it that fills that gap, this is a fantastic game to get to fill that, because it's great negotiation and it supports up to 7 players and it's not complicated. A lot of people are talking about that game, what is it, Sidereal Confluence? It's kind of an engine builder, like a simultaneous engine builder is my impression, which involves negotiation. And it's a big game, supports a lot of players, and it takes up a ton of table space. And looks kind of complicated. You don't want a complicated negotiation game. That just bogs down the negotiations. It's a layer that keeps you from just really getting into it. Because you're not just dealing with the other players, you're also dealing with the game mechanism. So ideally, you want a negotiation game where the rules kind of melt away. Chinatown does that, Quo Vadis does that. It's not too gamey, if that makes sense, and allows the negotiation to shine. The fact, in particular, that this goes up to 7 players makes this, if you're interested in a negotiation game, this is almost a must-buy. It's a fantastic game. I wholeheartedly recommend it. Thanks for watching. Older games like Quo Vadis don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Bitewing showed that with Quo Vadis. Take care.